Who'd be a broadcaster these days? Competition from streaming services means traditional, linear, let's all gather round the telly together moments are increasingly rare. And of course, audiences are on the wane. Yet on the rise is the BBC licence fee. Frozen at £159 2 years ago, the government have now announced that in 2014 the fee will rise by £10.50. The £15 rise originally proposed, just a little rich for the Culture Secretary's liking. In fact, Lucy Fraser took the opportunity to announce a review of the BBC's funding model, which means a review of the licence fee itself. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, we'll be asking where the BBC goes next. I'm joined by Alice Enders, Director of Research at Enders Analysis, and Roger Mosey, formerly head of BBC Television News, now Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge. Roger, the phrase not fit for purpose is, I think we will both agree, overused, particularly in your old job, back when you were heading up television news. But when it comes to the licence fee, there does feel to be a growing dissatisfaction with those who pay it. Certainly, if you look at the numbers, they do appear to be coming down. What is your view? I mean, is there an alternative to the way in which the BBC is currently funded?
Well, here at Selwyn College, I'm surrounded by hundreds of young people who do find the idea of paying for a licence to watch TV deeply bizarre, and it is really. It's a real anachronism. However, it may be the least worst way of funding the BBC. And there are options that they could look at. I've personally never been against the idea it might be funded by general taxation. And that has always had the argument that, well, it might lead to political interference, but you sure as heck get political interference now anyway. So the idea that general taxation may be set by a parliamentary committee, may be linked in some way to inflation, but also, crucially, progressive. So it means that if you weren't paying tax, you wouldn't be paying for a BBC tax, and the richest would pay more. So I think there are different ways of doing it. The key thing is to make sure the BBC is funded.
Yeah, just on that point then, Alice, I mean, what do you make of an idea to perhaps, rather than paying a flat fee every year, for it to come from general taxation? It would be less noticeable, I think, to some people, which to many people seems to be the problem, that they don't like it because they see themselves having to pay it more than anything else.
I think if we look around us in the world, there are general taxation solutions. There are solutions without criminalization, but then there are high levels of evasion. For example, in Ireland, I believe, is moving to a general taxation solution, at least partly, because as a small country, it can't really raise enough revenues from its license fee to fund its public service broadcasting. In France, the household levy was eliminated, and the issue of funding their public service broadcaster, whose name is France Télévisions, came before the parliament. And I'm afraid to say that the political dimension of this was immediately obvious. So that public sector broadcaster is in really big trouble. It has now 1 year only of funding. A lot of what the BBC commissions is multi-year. You know, every time it makes a commission to David Attenborough, it's going to take years for it to come to our screens.
I mean, Roger, it does strike me that whenever we are talking about the BBC, it is either about the licence fee or about criticisms that are coming from individuals within central government. And I do wonder if you detect that this review might be to do with more than necessarily just how the BBC is funded.
I think Alice can put up all sorts of reasons against other systems, and many of them are valid. But the really big question is there consent for the BBC and for the licence fee? And I think at the moment there is, in that 90% of people use the BBC each week. But it's clearly getting more precarious. And in drama and in other fields, the streamers and the big commercial companies are doing really, really well. There is a sense that the BBC isn't performing quite as distinctively as maybe it should in the marketplace. So you have this question of, is there political support for the BBC from Westminster? Also, is there public support? And at the moment, I still think there's everything to play for, but there is clearly a trajectory in which political support falls off a cliff because public consumption of the BBC keeps going down. And the trend is unmistakable, but, the hope is that you can make an argument for why public broadcasting and a public space, especially for news, are ever more essential given the kind of world we now live in.
Thanks, guys. We will return to Roger and Alice in just a moment when we will focus on the BBC's news output and whether or not it might be playing a part in the discussions around the licence fee. Back soon. Welcome back. Now, I must admit, I speak as someone who spent many a cold evening standing in Downing Street alongside colleagues from the BBC. But I do think it's fair to say that news is at the heart of what the organisation does, and yet we constantly hear about the pressures that exist on the news and current affairs budget. Most recently, of course, the cuts taking place to Newsnight. Roger, look, even if we get this licence fee settlement situation sorted out, it does feel like the BBC is crying out for more money, and I just wonder where that should come from.
I think that's true. And look, I'm a news person like you, so therefore I would defend news. But I think there is a democratic argument about the BBC and news. So I am worried about the fact that the BBC's priorities seem to be in cutting Newsnight's budget, and sitting here in Cambridge, we lost our regional news programme, our local radio station has been dramatically cut back, and you can see the news agenda is thinner across the place. Now, against that, you have a BBC peak time schedule, which on Saturday night includes The Wheel and Blankety Blank. They brought back Survivor as a decaying entertainment format from 20 years ago. It's not doing very well in the ratings. They're going to bring back Gladiators. And I think the BBC should be back to old-time religion and doing things that it does really, really well. British drama, high-quality entertainment and the news. And some of the stuff that's on at the moment, clearly just to get share from the channels, is less defensible. So I'm worried about the priorities the BBC is showing in cutting back.
Yeah, I'm going to speak up in defence of Gladiators here. The sight of two giant muscly men, knocking each other around with massive cotton buds has always been something that's remained with me since my youth. But Alice, just in terms of the public perception of the BBC, how much do you think of the discussion that takes place in the public sphere about the future of the BBC is shaped by the way in which people view it? It feels to me these days there has been more overt criticism of the BBC, and particularly its news and current affairs output, than there has been for an awfully long time.
The fact is, if the BBC reduces its programming in one area or another area, then it's always going to attract complaints. I, in particular, agree with Roger Mosey that local news radio services were actually very important to the communities. And I know that there's been a number of MPs that have spoken up against, those cuts. And I agree with you that what really matters ultimately is the public's adherence to the BBC. And here, I have to say that the numbers that we look at show that young people don't really distinguish the BBC from ITV, from Channel 4, and so on. They've just turned off the TV. This happened in 2020 during the pandemic. We saw a massive decline in viewing among young people. I guess they all went off and were entranced with gaming and Netflix and YouTube and TikTok and all the rest of it. So I think the issue of public adherence to the license fee really relates to young people. And I know the BBC is very aware of it. ITV is very aware of it. Channel 4 is very aware of it because they actually have a mandate to reach young people. This is the one generation where I think because of the digital age, we have to call into question all of linear TV services, not just the BBC.
But the Reithian values that are at the heart of what the BBC does, how strong is the link to the licence fee? Are other models, for example, a subscription model that younger people would feel more comfortable with? Certainly that's the way that they get a lot of their content through the streaming services. Would a subscription model just not stand up? Are there other issues around the BBC continuing if it went to that kind of subscription model?
Well, my understanding is the BBC has looked at subscription models, and there's a problem with them. And you could see that there's a way of doing it. For instance, if you take Wimbledon, that you may put centre court live onto BBC One through the tournament. And if you wanted the other courts, you'd pay a subscription through the iPlayer to watch the other courts. So you could do the same with the proms, and with a drama, you could release the first episode on BBC One and then make the box set available on subscription. The problem is that you can't get both good enough quality to guarantee a license fee for the free-to-air stuff and a strong enough proposition to get people to go to subscription. So it's a very tricky thing. Once you start going to subscription, there are all sorts of minefields being created. And I think the other risk is that there are those moments when we come together for Strictly Come Dancing and Doctor Who and the Euro finals and all the rest of it, which just wouldn't be the case if there was a subscription model. So I think the way you go forward is quite tricky. Where I feel sympathy for the BBC is I recognise that it's hard now with a digital world to get the kind of Reithian values into a digital world, especially in news. And my criticism would be that I think the BBC has been very, very good at making programmes, at making Newsnight and a Today programme. And it's less good in a digital space because it doesn't quite fit in the same way. And at times you get the BBC website being down market, in my view, of certainly of Sky News and ITV News, who will run stories on the BBC website that you wouldn't. And I find that a bit perplexing. And I think it's partly because there's this itch to get clickbait and itch to get younger audiences, which can, if you're not careful, erode the Reithian values you talk about.
But just on that topic, Roger, I mean, we've danced around it a bit. Do you think that some of the criticism that has been laid at the door of the BBC of late, which undoubtedly has fueled the debate about funding and so on, do you think any of that is valid?
Look, the BBC is under attack from a political point of view just for existing. So I completely reject that. And the idea that you could just scrap the BBC and British broadcasting would be fine is a ridiculous idea. Then I think there are those of us who think the BBC can improve in some key areas and that not everything it's done has necessarily had the right priorities and that some of the things they do should be more distinctive in the marketplace. I think you can believe those two things. And my argument would be that if you get the BBC more correct, more right in the sense of fitting its values, meeting its audiences, you can then more easily whack away the stupid political criticism, which is just designed to undermine the whole institution.
I mean, Alice, you will be able to detect the irony dripping from this question, coming as it does for a presenter who works for Sky. But I'm wondering, do you see an opportunity for the BBC in the future to become self-sustaining through the profit-generating arm?
You know, the license fee raises £3.7 billion, and then the BBC has a very large commercial arm, and it receives a dividend from that commercial arm, BBC Studios. But that's not a huge amount. It's like £350 million. So it's not enough to really replace the license fee. I think that one of the things that's been quite exciting in the recent years has been the way in which the fact that the BBC, sort of hived off BBC Studios and, put it into a commercial arm means that there's a lot of joint ventures that are now possible across the industry. The BBC is receiving commissions from other broadcasters. I do think that this question of efficiencies through joint ventures, through collaboration and so on, I think this is the way for the industry to go ahead in terms of funding those really expensive high-end dramas and programs and so on that we've really come to love the BBC for. I would really hate to see David Attenborough not be feasible for the BBC in terms of funding, but it's the big programs that are going to get cut.
Roger, just a last word for you. And look, speaking as someone who pays his mortgage through working for a company that makes boxes that put things on your telly, I'm very, very keen to see television continue and be as vibrant and diverse, multifaceted as is possible. Do you think, with a couple of the recent changes that have happened at the BBC, new chair, of course, Samir Shah coming in, do you see perhaps the ship as having steadied? Or is this going to be a very, very difficult time for the BBC for the foreseeable?
I'm delighted by Samir Shah being the new chair of the BBC because I think he's got, we're used to chairs of the BBC who have to have broadcasting explained to them and told, that's a TV and that's a radio. And Samir is steeped in television. He knows all about it. He's worked as a journalist. I think that's helpful to Tim Davie, who is an admirable man, but hasn't actually had the journalistic coalface experience. So I think Samir will be a great support for Tim. And also, I feel that with those two in charge, they do know what the BBC's values should be. So I hope there's a period of stability. Of course, you can't ignore the facts, and I never see a change of government as being a solution, because we remember the way a Labour government persecuted the BBC over Iraq. But I think the BBC will hope that if there is a Labour government, that there will be a bit more support for proper funding of the BBC, and the ideological axis which has been against it in the most recent years will fade away a bit. So there's some hope, I think, that the BBC may get on a more stable footing.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks to you too, Alice. And that is your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll see you again soon.